In Hebrew, the word for parable is mashal, which means dominion or rulership. And in rabbinic literature, that word mashal would be translated to what may the matter be compared. So we know that Yeshua began many of his parables with, the kingdom of heaven is like. So join me in this series and let's find out what the kingdom of heaven is like. Shalom, I'm Dr. Dina Dye with Foundations in Torah, and this series is on parables, and we've been talking about the parables, Proverbs, and the subtitle is really From Exile to Return, and we're putting it in the context of rulership and kingship. So in order to understand that, we really need to go back to the fourth day of creation, and if you'll recall, on the fourth day, it talks about the sun and the moon being governing the night and the day. The sun governing the day, of course the moon governing the night, and the stars as part of that rulership. And so this Hebrew word mashal is used in this particular example in Genesis. In fact, this is the very first time that mashal is actually used. So isn't it interesting that we have here that with the orbs, the sun and the moon being set in the heavens, and compared to or using the term rulership or dominion over the earth, if you will. So this language of dominion is very important. Now, a great example of this is if we go to the story of Joseph, and you'll recall Joseph's dreams. Of course, the sons, the brothers, got very upset about these dreams because Joseph is really communicating that something about dominion and rulership. This will take us right back to Adam, who was placed in the garden to be a king and to rule over that. From that place, the garden is seen as kind of like the palace or the throne area, ruling over the entire earth. And of course, he breaks the commandments of God, he violates the commandment, he eats from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then he is exiled out of the garden. So this one who would rule and reign, this king, is the one who would bring order to the cosmos. So this idea of rulership becomes very important. So back to Joseph's dream, you'll recall there's this comparison of how the son in this case would be Jacob, Rachel, Jacob's wife, she represented the moon, and the stars would be represented by Joseph's brothers. And of course, he would be the king or the ruler, and they were all being as subjects to him. And so this language of dominion becomes very important, and the dominion of from Adam to the second Adam, Yeshua the Messiah. Again, the Bible is really mostly about this comparison with a kingdom and this conflict between the kingdoms of this world and the kingdom of God. This is very much the language of the Bible. So parables, basically as we define them, and probably in language you're more familiar with, are a story basically that teaches some sort of moral, the moral of a story. And a lot of times the parable, there's no real identifying details. We don't have specifics. These aren't historical events and giving us information in that way. But these are stories that describe a certain reality. And Yeshua used the language of the day. Some of these parables, if you will, were familiar to the people. Maybe another person, another itinerant rabbi maybe had a story that was similar. Yeshua always took something that was familiar to the people. He didn't describe something that wasn't familiar to them at all. He took something that they were used to, that the world around them was common to them. So the parables, again, they describe sort of a certain reality, physical reality. They do not contain divine visions. It's mostly concluded that these parables were in Hebrew. These were stories very typical we find in rabbinic literature, and there are multiple sources on this, but these are very common sort of rabbinical stories we find in the literature and we find in the New Testament. It's just Yeshua took those common stories and he went farther with them than what they were used to hearing. Some of them probably already knew the endings to the stories because they'd heard them before. And so along comes Yeshua and he puts a twist on it. It makes them sit up and take notice because that is not the ending that they're used to hearing. This again, I think, alludes to Yeshua talking about the mystery or these hidden words, is because the ending or the conclusion of the story was not anything that they were familiar with. We don't really find the parables as these stories in any of the post-biblical literature, not in the Apocrypha. We don't find this in Josephus. In the pseudepigraphic writings, we don't find this. But it's not typical of any kind of Greek or Roman literature, not for that period. But it is very common in the Hebrew literature. And so this is the culture that is unique to the New Testament period, the first century. And again, it's important to keep the context in mind because it's talking about a cosmic kingdom. Even though their world, they got a real king, they got real rulers over the temple, they got Rome running the show, Yeshua is trying to point them to something greater than what their surroundings are. He's trying to point them to the cosmic rule of God, because they are not, after Yeshua dies, Rome continues to run the show. The temple's still standing for approximately 40 years, and the temple had become kind of a corrupt place. Those who were running the show saw it as their fiefdom, and they made a lot of money off of that. And so the physical world is still there, and it's not a pretty sight. And there's going to be wars after that, up to the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt, approximately 135 BCE, and on it goes, and eventually the fall of the Roman Empire, etc. So the events on the ground, the physical world in which they live, is not going to change. They are still going to be oppressed and enslaved by. However, God, through Yeshua, is showing the people the cosmic rule of God. It is under the cosmic rule of God in which they will be free indeed, in which they have been delivered, in which the exile is over, in which they have been restored. This is the key. Even though our physical situation hadn't changed, the cosmic situation, the heaven and earth and sea, God ruling and reigning over all of the universe, that is what's changed. And so now, who is your allegiance to? Are you going to align yourself with Rome and the Caesars, or the Herods, or the temple leadership, or you're going to align yourself with God under the rulership of his Son? That becomes critical. These kingdom stories speak of the exile that they're experiencing, and these kingdom stories, these parables, talk about the restoration tucked away in that. Some of these stories are really short, and yet this is the message, this is the underlying message. And so we could argue in Genesis chapter 1, we have the creation of the world, the rulership, dominion put under the feet of mankind, of Adam, who is to rule and reign under the authority of God himself, Adam to rule under his sovereignty. And so that is the language of the creation. And yet Adam violates the commandment, he violates the covenant, he breaks the covenant, he's exiled out of the garden, but God has a way to continue to restore things. And so the idea of new creation comes out of the creation that is experiencing chaos and decay, new creation will come. And I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but this is the language throughout the Bible is the idea of this new house that would be built, this new creation that would come forth. And this is what we're going to find in the parable stories. It is the rebuilding of the house, the rebuilding of the cosmic temple. And we've talked some about the king seated on the throne, and he is to rule with justice and righteousness. Those are the two qualifiers for a king to bring about order and restoration to a nation. And so if a king does not rule justly and does not rule in righteousness, but he is a wicked and bad king, then the nation will find itself in chaos and basically being destroyed. And so Yeshua into that was telling the folks of a kingdom that was centered on him. He was their king. He was their Messiah, the Son of God, the Son of David, who would rule, the dynasty of David, who would rule and reign. And so in telling the stories that the folks, again, would have been somewhat familiar with, some of these stories, he was inviting those that were listening, he was inviting the hearers to be part of that story. And he was inviting them to hear how one could be free. Because, again, as I mentioned, they were being oppressed by in multiple areas of their life, practically everywhere. Rome, of course, Caesar's, under Caesar, from the Herodian kings, and also from the temple ruling elite. So it was kind of a triune thing, that they were being oppressed and squeezed on every side. And it is into this that Yeshua came and told these stories about how the exile would end, even though they were in exile, and how the kingdom would be restored. And so through this, the stories, the parables speak of a redemption, if you will, from slavery by foreign powers. This is the thing that those people understood best. This is something we don't really understand. We live in a nation, basically, we've been free for several hundred years, free to pretty much do whatever we want, free to pretty well destroy the nation. But this idea of being held captive and being enslaved to a foreign power, Israel lived like that for a really long time. In fact, I think they were under a foreign power more than they weren't. So this idea of being free in the natural sense, of being able to kind of live your own life and be able to, establish his business and family and move wherever you want to move and make as much money as you want to make or not, this is a foreign concept. And so they spent most of Israel was mostly ruled by foreign powers. And so again, I talked about the Babylonian exile, which was really the seminal moment in the history of Israel. And the Bible speaks of that particular event almost more than in anything else. That was the lens or the filter through which some of Israel's later writers would write about their history, is through the lens of the Babylonian exile. So we haven't experienced exile in that way. And what did exile mean to them? Well, they lost their land, they lost their temple, the presence of God was no longer in their midst. They lost their culture. They lost their financial prowess. Commerce was affected. The laws under which they lived, that was affected. All sense of cohesion of a community is gone. They've lost their citizenship because they are no longer governed by their kings. They are essentially stateless, and they are homeless. And this is what's happened to them. We can't even conceive of it unless you happen to be one of these stateless, homeless people in some of the countries of the world today, like the Rohingyas in Myanmar, who were never given citizenship of their country and basically were forced into exile into Bangladesh. They are stateless, homeless. living in a refugee camp with 1.2 million people in probably 6 to 8 square miles. So that's an example today of what this might be like. The Rohingyas had lived in Myanmar for, I don't know, about 8 centuries. But think of Israel going back millennia, and they have been uprooted out of their nation and into a foreign land. This is huge and something that we don't really understand all that well. So they were, what we also have a hard time understanding is the kingdom concept in the natural world. It is basically political. The Bible is dealing with the political reality of Israel all through it. Especially we see in the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, etc. And the language of it's all about money, follow the money, is really very true. So as they're in exile and being enslaved by foreign oppressors, that uproots them and takes away any sort of power they might have. Now we know over time in Babylon, as the folks settled in, they did begin to produce. They had families, and families grew, and they established businesses, etc., etc. The problem with that is things actually got pretty good in exile, to the point where they didn't really want to go back to the land. Because if they were going to go back to the land, there was nothing there for them. It was just in a state of decay. Nothing had been rebuilt. It wasn't a pretty picture, and it wasn't a place they wanted. They were not going to go back and have great businesses and buy property and do all that sort of thing. The point of going back to the land was, of course, to rebuild a house for their God, which many of them did not want to do because they were in comfort. And we do find ourselves in a similar place oftentimes today. We would much rather make sure that we keep our comfort than build a place for the presence of God. Now, I'm not talking about per se building a temple, going to Israel and building a temple, but I'm talking about building the house for God, for his presence, from living stones, which is supposed to be the body of Messiah. We are supposed to be a body, a cohesive body, in unity and solidarity with one another, building a house so that the presence of God can be in our midst. And basically, we're more concerned about our creature comforts than we are about building up the body of Messiah. And God has given us the tools to build the body of Messiah and to make this temple a place for God's presence, so that presence can rule and reign from that sphere. And he's given the fivefold ministry in the community in order to build up the house. And unfortunately, we find, I would say today in America, Christians living in a state of fear, enjoying their comfort and their wealth and their livelihood, which we can understand, but to the point where they won't push back against the culture. They won't push back against bad law, bad rulings, bad kings. And this is where we find ourselves. We have basically turned over our nation to the kingdoms of this world, and they are ruling over us, and we're living under them, and things are going to find ourselves enslaved and oppressed in ways that we can't even imagine. So just as a side note, while we still have freedom, we need to push back against that and see our God raised up in our midst to take back what we've lost. But that's where Israel found themselves under Roman rule at the time of Yeshua. Now, of course, we know the temple was destroyed 586 BCE when King Nebuchadnezzar destroyed it, and the children of Israel went into exile. But then again, we have in 70 Common Era, when the Romans basically destroyed it under Titus, and there was nothing left, not a stone standing on top of one another. Again, that was their center of gravity. It would be kind of like if the White House and the State House, not the State House, but the Congress, if it was, those buildings were completely wiped out and all the people with it, and there was nothing left, this country couldn't function. Maybe it could, but basically the country could not function without leadership. And so this destruction of the temple took away everything. And it was it was, of course, the children who were left in the land of Israel were dispersed to all quarters of the Roman Empire. And that's what we call the diaspora. They eventually migrated to the four corners of the earth. And so the parables that Yeshua into this environment, the parables, Yeshua speaks of the restoration of the kingdom, about the return from exile to the land where they would be free. It signified, these stories signify or pointed to like the Exodus out of Egypt. And so Yeshua, through them, was communicating the need as in himself of a new Moses, of an Exodus, of a liberation that they needed. They desperately needed. They understood that. They were in need of victory, of deliverance and freedom over these pagan tyrants. And so these narratives of the parables really take us all the way back to Exodus, if you will. This is the language of recreation, of new creation, the language of being set free. So this is what, it's hard for us to even imagine that kind of message coming forth from Yeshua as he went from temple to Galilee and around the environs of Israel, this message of freedom. It's hard for us to imagine. For the Jewish people and the traditions, the Exodus, of course, is the ultimate event in the Bible. And those who have celebrated a Passover Seder, who've been invited to such a thing, will understand the whole story of the Exodus was seen in Passover. And so it's a very important story, the deliverance and freedom that comes at Passover. But Israel has found herself in the midst of pagan nations multiple times. Good example, of course, Egypt, and then we have our Exodus in Babylon is what I've been talking about. And they have found themselves to be slaves, brought initially free in their own land and then brought down to these other nations to become slaves. And so it's through this kind of language, this Exodus type language, that Yeshua is communicating the story of the kingdom of heaven, the story of the parables, of how they could truly be free, what it means to truly be free in a whole different way than they were familiar with. So again, I've been laying the foundation through quite a number of programs here, just to kind of I want you to rethink the way you approach the Bible. I want you to rethink how the story of how the parables are told. It's important to go back and look at the context, the historical context, in whatever period in the Bible that you're evaluating. In particular, in the New Testament, if we're going to understand the parables, we've got to understand what was the environment like into which Yeshua entered. What was everyday like for the folks? What was it like to live under Roman rule? And so if we can understand just how oppressive it was, living under these pagans, living under these oppressors, to hear these stories told, they weren't just nice stories that some people got and some people didn't. These are stories that were to penetrate the heart. These were stories to let the people know that there is a cosmic kingdom and that God is ruling and reigning over that kingdom and that they can be set free in that kingdom. This is very important. They were called through the parables to repent of the sin that had driven Israel into exile repeatedly, over and over again, breaking the covenant, breaking the commandments that God had established, because those commandments were like the testimony of the king to bring comfort and to bring healing and to bring life to the place where they lived. And so the idea was, it wasn't just about returning to the land, because they were already in the land at the time. It was about returning to their God, Yod He Vav He. It's about returning to Him with their whole heart. It's about He would set them free, and that Yeshua would be the instrument to bring healing and health and to rescue them from the oppression that they were experiencing. And the oppression externally would continue, but yet Yeshua would deliver them in their life, and things would be radically different from that. And so this, again, the key in all of this is to understand how important the historical events are in the Bible and how that has shaped Israel, so that they would recognize Messiah, the King, when He came. Now, of course, not everybody did. There were plenty that didn't. But for those who did, for those who heard, for those who recognized that the kingdom is transformative, that there is a kingdom that exists, there's a king that is ruling and reigning over that kingdom, and that kingdom is the kingdom of our God and of His Lord and of His Messiah, and that He will reign forever and ever. This was the message that they came and that Yeshua brought to them through the language of the parables. Now, I bet you never even would consider that the parables would have so much behind them. They just seemed to us like quaint little stories. I would imagine that the parables have probably been talked about from the New Testament almost more than anything else that Yeshua said. We're all familiar with them. One's like the prodigal son, which we're going to talk to we're going to talk about in a completely different light. Again, some of them are really short, but the pearl of great price, I mean, it's a verse basically, or the mustard seed. But all of these, again, have a dimension of the kingdom that we're not really familiar with. And they're being spoken to a people who are ready, those who are ready to hear, and to hear that there is a kingdom greater than themselves. There's a kingdom that is greater than imperial Rome. And the influence of Rome around them, we can't even quite imagine, with Rome's gods and goddesses and the pantheon of gods basically running the show, and how challenging that environment must have been. And to even see their temple standing behind them, and yet things aren't running exactly the way they're supposed to. And into this, Yeshua the Messiah comes and declares that they can be set free. What an amazing thing. And so it would apply to us today. In the midst of, on every side, we feel like we've been pressed and squeezed and oppressed, and things are in chaos and things are insane. But there is a kingdom, and a king seated on the throne, ruling and reigning, and He will make you free. And so this is the story of the parables. We'll see you next time. Thanks for joining me. Shalom.